45 times the winners of history lied to everyone? What if the stories we've been told, the legends, the victories, the heroes, were all built on deception? From ancient empires to modern power struggles, those who claimed victory didn't just rewrite history, they buried the truth. In the next few minutes, we'll expose the lies that have shaped the world we know. Prepare for the shocking truths they didn't want you to discover. Chapter 1: The Fall of Troy, the Deception of the Wooden Horse. The story of Troy has been glorified for centuries, celebrated as a legendary battle of strength and honor. But the truth? It was a victory built on lies and trickery. The Greeks, after years of siege, couldn't break through the walls of Troy. So, they devised the ultimate deception, an enormous wooden horse left as a gift to the Trojans. They claimed it was a symbol of surrender, a gesture of goodwill. The Trojans, believing their enemies had given up, pulled the horse into the city, celebrating their supposed victory. But inside that horse, Greek soldiers waiting for the dead of night. That gift became the Trojan horse, the gateway to their downfall. The victors, the Greeks, painted this as a triumph of strategy, but it was the betrayal that cost Troy everything. But this wasn't the only time the winners twisted history to fit their own narrative. Chapter 2: Napoleon's Exile, the False Narrative of Defeat. Napoleon Bonaparte was a legend conqueror of Europe, a man who nearly reshaped the world. Yet, his final chapter was painted as a humbling defeat at Waterloo. The victors claimed his exile to St. Helena was the end of his power, but that was just the surface. The real truth? Napoleon wasn't simply defeated, he was betrayed. Europe's powers feared his return, so they forced him into isolation, manipulating history to write him off as a deluded tyrant. The narrative of his humble retreat was nothing more than a controlled lie to ensure his legacy remained in the shadows. They wanted to silence him. What he didn't know was that even in exile, the lies against him would only grow stronger. Chapter 3: The Spanish Inquisition. Lies under the banner of faith. The Spanish Inquisition is often depicted as a religious crusade to rid Spain of heresy, but in reality, it was a political tool designed to eliminate rivals and seize power. The Spanish crown used religion as a facade, hunting down Jews, Muslims, and anyone who threatened their rule. Millions were tortured, executed, or forced to convert, all while the victors of the Inquisition portrayed their actions as divinely inspired. This wasn't a battle for faith, it was a struggle for control, masked by the lies of religious purity. But the true cost of this deception would continue to haunt Spain for centuries. Chapter 4: The Assassination of Julius Caesar, the Betrayal of Rome. Julius Caesar's murder is often framed as a heroic act to save Rome from tyranny, but the truth is far more complex and far darker. The men who killed Caesar, including Brutus, weren't driven by noble ideals. Their motives? Power. They used the pretense of patriotism to justify an assassination rooted in jealousy and ambition. The victors of history wrote it as a savior's sacrifice, but it was a power grab that left Rome in chaos. The Republic didn't survive Caesar's death, it collapsed. And what happened after his death would ignite Rome's darkest period. Chapter 5: The War of Independence. The Broken Promises to Native Allies. The American Revolution is heralded as a victory for freedom, but it came at a heavy cost for Native Americans. The tribes that fought alongside the colonists were promised land and protection in return for their alliance. Once the British were defeated, however, the new American government quickly abandoned those promises. Native lands were seized, and the betrayal was complete. The victory that brought independence to the colonies was built on lies and broken trust, leaving the native nations to suffer. But this wasn't the only betrayal in America's fight for freedom. Chapter 6. The Sinking of the Lusitania. A deadly pretext for war. In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania was a tragedy that shocked the world. But what was not told to the public? The British knew the ship was carrying munitions, making it a legitimate military target. The tragedy was manipulated to spark U.S. involvement in World War I. The narrative spun by the victors made it seem like an unprovoked attack when, in truth, it was a calculated move to pull America into a war that was already set in motion. The truth was buried, and the loss of 1,200 lives became a tool for geopolitical maneuvering. And what followed next was a war that would change the world forever. Chapter 7. The Rise of Adolf Hitler, the Lies Behind the Nazi Myth. Adolf Hitler's rise to power wasn't just a result of charisma. It was a carefully constructed myth. The Nazi regime's propaganda machine painted him as a savior of Germany, feeding the public a twisted narrative of Aryan superiority. The victors of history have portrayed Hitler's rise as inevitable, but the reality is darker. His ascent was built on lies, fear, and the manipulation of the masses, spinning a horrific ideology as a beacon of hope. But these lies weren't just harmless, they would lead to one of history's greatest atrocities. What they didn't expect was the true cost of their deceit. Chapter 8. The Great Fire of London, a Convenient Disaster. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is often portrayed as a calamity, but was it really? Behind the flames, the fire cleared vast swaths of the city, wiping out rival businesses, political opposition, and debt. The ruling class seized this opportunity to rebuild London in their image, wealthier and more powerful. The victors painted it as an accident, a tragedy of fate. But the fire may have been far more convenient for those in power than they let on. The flames of destruction gave birth to a new London, one built on manipulation. And this wasn't the last disaster used to conceal a deeper conspiracy. Chapter 9. The Fall of the Berlin Wall. The deceptive end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall is often seen as the triumph of freedom over communism. But the truth? It wasn't a simple victory for the people. Both the Soviet Union and the West manipulated the event to shift global power. The wall's fall wasn't about the people demanding freedom. It was a strategic maneuver by global powers to reshape the political landscape in their favor. The Berlin Wall didn't just fall, it was pushed, and the truth was rewritten. But the collapse of the wall was only the beginning of a new deception. Chapter 10. The French Revolution. The betrayal of the revolutionaries. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity to a nation oppressed by monarchy. For years, the people had suffered under King Louis XVI and the aristocracy. The revolutionaries, led by figures like Robespierre, pushed to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic where power would rest with the people. But as soon as they seized control, their ideals began to unravel. Once in power, the revolutionaries did not uphold the promises of liberty and equality. Instead, they embraced terror and oppression. The revolution quickly turned into the Reign of Terror, a period marked by mass executions and the purging of political rivals. Robespierre, who once championed the revolution's ideals, became a tyrant himself, overseeing the execution of thousands under the guise of protecting the revolution from enemies. The revolutionaries, who had fought for freedom, now became the very oppressors they had despised. They had betrayed their own ideals, using violence to secure their power. The victors of the revolution twisted the narrative to frame it as a noble cause, yet the truth was a brutal power struggle that had sacrificed the people for the benefit of the few. The real cost of the French Revolution wasn't just the fall of the monarchy, it was the betrayal of its own people. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were twisted into tools of control. The revolution's ultimate victory? The rise of a new class of rulers who were just as oppressive as the ones they replaced. But this was only the beginning of how power would corrupt those who promised freedom. Chapter 11. The Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A convenient catalyst for war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 is often presented as the moment that ignited World War I. A lone gunman, Gavrilo Princip, took down the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and the world spiraled into war. However, this widely accepted narrative hides the political manipulation that preceded the event. The truth is that the assassination was only the spark, but the fire had already been set by the rivalries and power struggles between the European powers. Austria-Hungary had been looking for an excuse to crush Serbia, whose nationalist movements were threatening the empire's stability. With the assassination, they saw an opportunity to escalate tensions, while Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, was eager to push Europe into war to assert its own dominance. In the aftermath of the assassination, the European powers, rather than seeking peace, used it as an excuse to mobilize their military forces. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and alliances were triggered across the continent, turning what could have been a localized conflict into a world war. The victors of this narrative claimed it was a tragic, unavoidable event, but the reality was that it was a political move calculated, deliberate, and manipulated by those in power. And what followed would reveal how the lies of the victors shaped the bloodshed of World War I. Chapter 12. The British Empire's colonization. Lies of civilizing the world. The British Empire expanded across the globe with a justification that it was civilizing the nations it conquered. The British claimed they were bringing order, culture, and progress to so-called primitive peoples. But this was nothing more than a mask for exploitation and domination. Behind the veneer of civilization was a brutal system of colonization that involved theft of resources, forced labor, and the suppression of indigenous cultures. The British Empire built its wealth on the backs of slaves and colonized peoples, and the so-called benefits of British rule, like infrastructure and education, were merely tools used to extract wealth and maintain control. The victors wrote the history of British colonialism as a noble mission, overlooking the violence and atrocities committed along the way. Native populations were massacred, displaced, and subjugated, their land stolen, and their cultures erased. The true story of the British Empire's rise is one of deceit, manipulation, and the abuse of power, not a selfless mission to civilize the world. While Britain glorified itself as a beacon of progress, the cost of its empire was the destruction of countless civilizations and the suffering of millions. The lies that painted the British Empire as a force for good masked a legacy of cruelty and injustice, and the lies of British colonialism would continue to resonate for generations, shaping the world in ways the victors would never admit. Chapter 13. The Battle of Waterloo, the deceptive triumph over Napoleon. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 is often hailed as the decisive victory that ended Napoleon Bonaparte's reign. The narrative portrays it as a heroic stand against a tyrant who had conquered much of Europe. But the truth behind Napoleon's defeat is more complex and far darker. The battle itself was not just a military engagement, it was a culmination of strategic deception. The British and Prussian forces, led by Wellington and Blücher, didn't just defeat Napoleon through military superiority. They used a network of misinformation, false intelligence, and psychological tactics to manipulate Napoleon's decision-making. The victors rewrote history to make the battle seem like a fair and honorable fight. But in reality, the forces aligned against Napoleon employed deceit to ensure his downfall. Napoleon, though brilliant, was ultimately betrayed by his allies and underestimated the scale of the deception that was being employed against him. His defeat wasn't the result of a fair fight. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy his empire. The victors spun the story of Waterloo to present themselves as noble defenders of Europe. But in truth, it was a political maneuver designed to reshape Europe in their image. What they didn't expect was that Napoleon's ideas would endure, even in defeat. Chapter 14. The D-Day Deception. A brilliant lie to fool the Nazis. D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944, is often remembered as a monumental victory in World War II. But the success of the operation didn't rely solely on military strength. It relied on one of the most ingenious deceptions in military history. The Allies didn't just launch a direct assault. They manipulated the entire German command structure. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies used fake armies, false intelligence, and diversionary tactics to make the Germans believe the invasion would take place elsewhere at Calais, the shortest point across the English Channel. The deception was so convincing that the Germans concentrated their forces on the wrong beaches, leaving Normandy vulnerable. The victors of D-Day presented it as a triumph of bravery and planning. But behind that victory was an elaborate web of lies designed to deceive the enemy. The invasion was as much about misdirection as it was about military force. The Nazis had been misled, and the truth was concealed until it was too late for them to react. But the deception didn't end with D-Day. It would continue to shape the course of the war. Chapter 15. The Russian Revolution. Lenin's deceptive rise to power. The Russian Revolution of 1917 is often portrayed as the dawn of a new era, a fight for the working class and the promise of equality. But the truth behind Lenin's rise to power is one of manipulation and deception. Lenin, hailed as the champion of the people, was more interested in establishing a totalitarian regime than in fulfilling the ideals of the revolution. Lenin's promises of peace and equality were used as tools to gain support. Once in power, he quickly consolidated control, silenced political opposition, and set the stage for a reign of terror under the guise of Marxist ideology. The Bolshevik Revolution was not a noble struggle. It was a calculated power grab that discarded the very ideals it had promised. The victors of the revolution framed Lenin as a hero who fought for the people, but the reality was that he betrayed the masses, replacing one form of tyranny with another. Lenin's deception laid the groundwork for decades of Soviet oppression. The revolution, which had promised freedom and equality, instead gave rise to a dictatorship that would control Russia for generations. And Lenin's lies would not end with his rise to power. They would define the Soviet Union for years to come. Chapter 16. The Treaty of Versailles. The betrayal that led to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles is often seen as the peace agreement that ended World War I, but in reality, it was a betrayal that planted the seeds for World War II. The victors of the war, led by Britain and France, imposed crippling reparations on Germany, punishing them for the war's destruction. But what they didn't tell the world was that this treaty wasn't about justice, it was about revenge. Germany was economically devastated, and the terms ensured their future resentment. This wasn't peace, it was the creation of a time bomb set to explode decades later. And what followed was a global catastrophe, fueled by the very lies the victors had told. Chapter 17. The American Dream. A myth perpetuated by the elite. The American dream was sold as the ultimate promise that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve success. But for millions, this dream was a lie. The elite used this myth to manipulate the masses into believing in a system that was rigged from the start. It wasn't about equality. It was about keeping the rich in power while feeding the poor with an illusion of hope. The American dream wasn't a reality, it was a tool of control. But the deeper you dug into this myth, the more lies you uncovered. Chapter 18. The Stalinist purges the lies behind the Soviet utopia. Joseph Stalin's reign wasn't the rise of a great leader. It was the story of a man who used lies to consolidate power. Stalin's purges, which saw millions executed or imprisoned, were not about protecting the state. They were about silencing opposition and building a dictatorship. The myth of the Soviet utopia was built on blood, terror, and deceit, as Stalin manipulated history to maintain control over the people. What he promised as equality was, in fact, the total destruction of freedom. But the lies didn't end with Stalin. His legacy would leave Russia in a stranglehold for decades. Chapter 19. The Founding of Israel, the Deceptive Creation of a Nation. The founding of Israel in 1948 is often celebrated as a triumph for the Jewish people, but the truth is far more complex and painful. The creation of Israel came at the expense of the Palestinian population, with deceitful promises and manipulative political maneuvering. The victors wrote the history of Israel's birth as a noble act, but in reality, it was built on betrayal, forced displacement, and the erasure of Palestinian rights. The birth of a nation was also the death of a people's homeland, and this betrayal would continue to shape the Middle East for decades to come. Chapter 20. The Vietnam War, the lies behind the domino theory. The Vietnam War was sold to the public as a fight against the spread of communism, with the U.S. claiming it was necessary to protect global democracy. But the truth was more insidious. The domino theory was a lie, created to justify American intervention. The war was about control, geopolitics, and maintaining power in Southeast Asia. Millions of lives were lost for a cause built on falsehoods. The victors claimed victory for democracy, but the real cost was far more devastating. But the lies surrounding the war were only the beginning of America's deceptive tactics abroad. Chapter 21. The Cold War, Lies on Both Sides. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies, it was a battle of lies. The United States and the Soviet Union fed the world false narratives to justify their actions. Both sides manipulated the truth, using propaganda to portray themselves as the defenders of freedom and peace, while they engaged in global espionage and covert operations. The victors of the Cold War shaped history to fit their needs, hiding the darker truths of their actions. The real cost of this ideological struggle? Countless lives, endless suffering, and a global deception that lasted for decades. And these lies weren't contained to the Cold War. What followed would shape the world for generations. Chapter 22. The Enron Scandal, Corporate Lies that Crumbled an Empire. Enron was once a symbol of corporate success, but behind the glossy reports and soaring stock prices was a house of cards built on deception. The company's leaders manipulated financial statements, hid debts, and lied to investors, employees, and regulators. The truth was buried under layers of false profits. When the company finally collapsed, it wasn't just Enron that was destroyed. It was the trust in corporate America itself. What they didn't expect was the ripple effect their lies would cause throughout the global economy. Chapter 23. The Rise of Mao Zedong, Lies of the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution was sold as a movement to purify China, to rid the country of capitalist influences. But the truth was far darker. Mao used lies to manipulate the youth, inciting violence and purges against anyone deemed a threat. This wasn't about revolution, it was about consolidating power through terror. Millions were killed, and the country was torn apart in the name of a myth. But the Cultural Revolution was just one chapter in Mao's brutal rule. His legacy of lies would continue for decades. Chapter 24. The Panama Papers, The Lies of the Global Elite. The Panama Papers exposed the world's wealthiest hiding their money in offshore accounts to evade taxes and launder money. These elites had been lying to the public for decades, manipulating global finance and hiding the truth of their wealth. They were protected by a web of lies and deceit, using legal loopholes to shield their wealth from scrutiny. The scandal revealed the extent of the global corruption. But what was truly shocking, the public was just beginning to realize how deep the lies went. And what came next would expose even darker truths about the financial system. Chapter 25. The Watergate Scandal. The Betrayal of American Democracy. The Watergate scandal revealed the dark underbelly of American democracy. President Nixon's lies about his involvement were only the tip of the iceberg. The cover-up was a desperate attempt to maintain control, fueled by a sense of entitlement and fear of losing power. The scandal exposed a government willing to sacrifice the truth to stay in power, and it shattered the public's trust in their leaders. The victors of the story were the ones who lied to protect themselves, and the price of their deceit was the integrity of democracy itself. But the fallout from Watergate wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a chain reaction of betrayals. Chapter 26. The Battle of Hastings. The Conquest of Lies. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is often portrayed as a noble conquest, but the truth is far more brutal. William the Conqueror's victory over King Harold wasn't just about military might. It was a conquest built on deceit. Harold was promised the throne by Edward the Confessor, but William, backed by the Pope, manipulated history to justify his invasion. William wasn't just fighting for power. He was rewriting the narrative to secure his reign. The victors painted this as a battle for England's future, but in reality, it was the beginning of centuries of betrayal and manipulation. And the lies surrounding the conquest didn't just fade, they shaped the very foundations of the nation. Chapter 27. The Italian Renaissance lies behind the Golden Age. The Italian Renaissance is often celebrated as a time of enlightenment, a rebirth of art and culture. But beneath the surface, it was a time of lies, manipulation, and corruption. The powerful families, like the Medici, used their wealth to control the narrative, erasing their own bloody deeds and power grabs. The Golden Age wasn't about noble ideals, it was a period of ruthless ambition disguised as cultural brilliance. The victors rewrote history, masking the greed and deception that fueled the era. But the true cost of this Golden Age would be hidden in plain sight. Chapter 28. The 2008 Financial Crisis, a Web of Lies. The 2008 financial crisis was a disaster, but it wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a man-made catastrophe. Wall Street's elite lied, manipulated, and created a financial bubble that collapsed, devastating the global economy. They sold toxic mortgages, lied about the risk, and covered up the truth until it was too late. What they didn't expect was the long-term fallout from their lies, a global recession that shattered lives and economies. And the fallout from this scandal would continue to reshape the financial world for decades to come. Chapter 29. The Salem Witch Trials, the lies that sparked a mass hysteria. The Salem witch trials are often seen as a dark chapter in history, but the truth is even darker. The trials weren't just fueled by superstition, they were driven by lies, fear, and personal vendettas. The victors of this story were the accusers, who used lies to destroy their enemies. Innocent women were executed, their lives ruined by the lies of those in power. The trials didn't just ruin lives, they destroyed a community. The truth was twisted, and the consequences were catastrophic. But this wasn't the end of the lies, it was just the beginning of a much larger wave of hysteria. Chapter 30. The Battle of Thermopylae, the Myth of the 300. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE is one of history's most iconic moments, where 300 Spartans made a heroic stand against the Persian Empire. The myth of this battle portrays it as a valiant last stand for freedom, with the brave warriors fighting to the death in the face of overwhelming odds. But the truth behind this legendary moment is far more complex. While the 300 Spartans did indeed fight heroically, they were not simply defending freedom. They were also engaged in a battle for power and control over Greece. The Greeks were not united in their cause, and the Spartans, while renowned for their military prowess, were also involved in political maneuvering. The Persians, led by Xerxes, were not only fighting to expand their empire, they were also seeking to eliminate Greek city-states that had long been a thorn in their side. The myth of Thermopylae was perpetuated by the victors of the war, those who wanted to present the battle as a heroic stand for freedom. The truth? It was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable Persian invasion, with many Greek city-states only reluctantly joining the fight. In the end, the 300 didn't save Greece. They bought time for the Greeks to regroup and prepare, but their sacrifice was framed as the turning point of the war. And the myth of Thermopylae would endure, shaping Greece's identity for centuries to come. Chapter 31. The Founding of the United States, the Exclusion of African Americans. The American Revolution is often framed as a noble fight for freedom, liberty, and independence from British rule. However, the reality for many people living in the new United States was very different. While the Founding Fathers championed the ideals of freedom and equality, these rights did not extend to African Americans, who remained enslaved in the South and excluded from the promises of liberty. The victors of the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers, crafted a narrative in which the struggle for freedom was central. Yet, they excluded a vast portion of the population from these freedoms. Slavery continued to thrive in the South, and African Americans had no legal rights, forced to endure brutal conditions on plantations. The new nation's independence was secured with the labor of those it denied freedom. The founding documents, including the Declaration of Independence, famously declared that all men are created equal. Yet the reality was that African Americans were excluded from this vision, as their status as property was maintained by the very people fighting for their own freedom. The victors of this narrative, in their quest to create a new nation, buried the truth of their betrayal, one that would lead to centuries of racial inequality. But this exclusion wasn't just about slavery. It was about a system of oppression that would persist throughout American history. Chapter 32. The Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The cover-up of a civil rights leader's death. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the 4th of April, 1968, is often depicted as the tragic loss of a leader dedicated to peace and equality, while the official story claims that James Earl Ray, a lone gunman, was responsible for King's death. The truth remains shrouded in mystery. Many have speculated that there was a larger conspiracy behind King's assassination, involving powerful figures in the U.S. government who wanted to silence his growing influence. King's leadership in the civil rights movement, advocating for nonviolent resistance, made him a significant threat to the status quo. He had begun to speak out against the Vietnam War and economic inequality, pushing for a radical transformation of American society. His activism was seen as increasingly disruptive by those in power. The official narrative, claiming Ray acted alone, has been challenged by several investigations and theories suggesting that King's death was part of a broader effort to eliminate a leader who posed a threat to the established order. The cover-up surrounding his assassination reflects the fear of change and the lengths to which the powerful will go to protect their dominance. King's assassination marked a turning point, but the truth behind his death remains elusive, and the real story of King's assassination is far darker than the world has been told. Chapter 33. The Korean War lies behind the heroic struggle. The Korean War, often remembered as a heroic stand against communism, was framed by the victors as a fight for freedom and democracy. The United States and its allies saw the war as part of the global struggle against the spread of communism, but the reality was far more complicated. The conflict was not just about ideology, it was about maintaining global influence and control over the Korean peninsula. The war began after North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, invaded South Korea, and the United States intervened under the banner of protecting democracy. But the deeper truth is that the U.S. had long been involved in the region, backing South Korean authoritarian regimes and even making covert efforts to destabilize the North. The war was a proxy struggle in the larger Cold War conflict, driven by geopolitical interests rather than pure ideology. The victors of the war, those who framed the narrative of the heroic struggle against communism, ignored the complex political realities that led to the war. Millions of Koreans died. Their country split in two, while the world's superpowers used them as pawns in a larger game. And the lies of the Korean War would continue to shape global politics for decades to come. Chapter 34. The Iraq War. Deception and Lies of Weapons of Mass Destruction. The Iraq War, which began in 2003, was justified by the Bush administration on the claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that could pose a threat to global security. This narrative was pushed relentlessly, with claims that Saddam Hussein had the capability to launch attacks that could devastate the West. The invasion was presented as a necessary action to protect the world from a growing threat. However, when the U.S. troops finally entered Iraq, no weapons of mass destruction were found. The intelligence used to justify the war was either misrepresented or fabricated. The lies about Iraq's WMDs were not merely mistakes. They were deliberate deceptions designed to rally public support for an invasion that had been planned long before. The consequences of the war were devastating, not only for Iraq, but for the entire region. The country was left in chaos, with the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and the war led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The true motivation for the invasion wasn't about security. It was about control over Iraq's oil reserves and reshaping the Middle East to serve Western interests. And the lies of the Iraq War would haunt the region for years, shaping the political landscape for decades. Chapter 35. The Assassination of Benazir Bhutto, Political Manipulation and Lies. The assassination of Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, in 2007 was a watershed moment in the country's history. Officially, it was claimed that Bhutto was killed by a lone gunman during a rally, but many believe her death was orchestrated by political forces within Pakistan, possibly with international involvement. Bhutto was a significant threat to the entrenched political and military elites, and her return to power was seen as a challenge to their control. Bhutto, once exiled for years, was returning to Pakistan with a promise to restore democracy and reform the political system. Her return was welcomed by the masses, but the powers in Pakistan who benefited from the status quo saw her as a destabilizing force. In this context, her assassination became a tool to remove a political rival and halt her campaign for change. The Pakistani government quickly placed the blame on the Taliban, but many believe this was a cover-up to conceal the real masterminds behind her death. The truth of Bhutto's assassination remains clouded in mystery, with those in power protecting their interests by controlling the narrative. The lies surrounding her assassination would continue to shape the politics of Pakistan for years to come. Chapter 36. The Discovery of America. The Lies Behind. Columbus's discovery. Christopher Columbus is often hailed as the brave explorer who discovered America. But the truth is far from the hero's tale we've been taught. Columbus didn't discover an empty land. He arrived in a place already inhabited by millions. His arrival marked the beginning of centuries of exploitation, disease, and death for Native Americans. Columbus's story was twisted into a narrative of discovery, hiding the brutal impact of his voyages. The victors of history rewrote the story to glorify Columbus, masking the genocide that followed. But Columbus was just the beginning of the lies that would define colonialism. Chapter 37. The Crusades. Religious lies, masking political power struggles. The Crusades were portrayed as holy wars to reclaim the Holy Land, but in reality, they were political power struggles masked by religious zeal. The Church used the promise of salvation to rally people, but the true motivations were territorial expansion and wealth. The victors of the Crusades, the Church, and European monarchs spun the narrative as a righteous cause, hiding the atrocities committed in their wake. The Crusaders didn't fight for God, they fought for land, wealth, and control. But the Crusades weren't the last time religion was used to mask political manipulation. Chapter 38. The Rise of the Roman Empire, the Lies of Roman Virtue. The Roman Empire is often praised for its strength and virtue, but the truth behind its rise is darker. The Romans, while presenting themselves as defenders of justice, built their empire on deceit, slavery, and conquest. The myth of Roman virtue masked the brutality that allowed them to dominate the ancient world. The victors of Rome's history spun tales of nobility and honor while erasing the violence that supported their reign. Roman greatness wasn't built on virtue, it was built on lies, and those lies would continue to define the Roman legacy for centuries to come. Chapter 39. The Japanese internment camps, the betrayal of innocent Americans. During World War II, Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps, stripped of their homes and livelihoods. The U.S. government justified the actions as a necessary precaution against espionage, but the truth? It was a blatant betrayal, fueled by racism and fear. The victors of history claimed it was a wartime necessity, but it was a gross violation of civil rights that destroyed the lives of innocent Americans. The lie of national security masked a devastating betrayal of the American ideals, but the consequences of this betrayal would linger long after the war ended. Chapter 40. The Alamo. The lie of remembering the heroes. The Battle of the Alamo in 1836 is often remembered as a heroic last stand of 180 Texian defenders against a much larger Mexican force. The story has been spun to emphasize bravery and sacrifice, portraying the defenders as martyrs for the cause of liberty. But the truth behind the Alamo is more complicated and far darker than the myth. The Texians, led by figures like James Bowie, Davy Crockett, and William B. Travis, were not fighting for freedom in the broader sense. They were fighting to preserve a system of slavery. The Texans had declared independence from Mexico, not just over political grievances, but because Mexico had begun to abolish slavery, which was crucial to the Texian economy. The Alamo's defenders weren't fighting for the ideals of democracy. They were fighting to protect their economic system based on human exploitation. The victors of the Texas Revolution, eager to frame the Alamo as a symbol of heroism and liberty, conveniently ignored the issue of slavery and painted the event as a fight for freedom. In reality, the battle was about power, land, and maintaining an unjust system. The myth of the Alamo as a noble sacrifice for freedom persists, but the real story is one of betrayal and the protection of a deeply flawed societal system. And the lies surrounding the Alamo would shape Texas history for generations. Chapter 41. The Black Death. The Lies of Scapegoating and Fear. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the 14th century, is remembered as one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. But beyond the terror of the disease itself, the aftermath was defined by lies, scapegoating, and political manipulation. At the time, the causes of the plague were unknown, and fear ran rampant. The church and political authorities, desperate to maintain control, pushed the narrative that certain groups were responsible for spreading the disease. Jews, already marginalized and distrusted, were scapegoated as the culprits. Rumors spread that they had poisoned the wells, leading to widespread violence against Jewish communities. In cities across Europe, Jewish people were persecuted, tortured, and massacred in response to these lies. The true cause of the plague, likely a bacterium carried by fleas on rats, was ignored in favor of more convenient, fear-driven explanations. The victors of this narrative, those who controlled the political and religious power, used the crisis to eliminate rivals and consolidate control, all while perpetuating lies that allowed them to retain power during a time of massive social upheaval. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It was used to further divide and control society through fear and falsehoods, and the consequences of these lies would haunt Europe for centuries to come. Chapter 42. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a manufactured crisis to maintain control. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is often presented as a pivotal moment in the Cold War, where the world came dangerously close to nuclear war. The narrative is that the Soviet Union's placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba was an act of aggression, forcing the U.S. into a tense standoff to defend democracy. But what if the crisis itself was manufactured, or at least exacerbated, by both superpowers to maintain their grip on global power? The United States, led by President John F. Kennedy, faced mounting pressure both domestically and internationally, and the threat of Soviet missiles in Cuba served as a convenient distraction from a series of internal crises. At the same time, the Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, used the situation to gain leverage in the global arena, projecting strength to its allies and rivals. In reality, both sides played the crisis to their advantage. Kennedy and Khrushchev both manipulated the situation to rally their people and strengthen their political positions. The threat of nuclear war was the perfect catalyst for maintaining control over their respective nations. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just about the safety of the world, it was a geopolitical chess game played by two superpowers seeking to reinforce their dominance. And the lies of this crisis would have long-term repercussions for the Cold War and beyond. Chapter 43. The Suez Crisis, Political Lies and Global Manipulation. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is often framed as a fight for control over the strategic Suez Canal, a vital waterway for international shipping. The official narrative suggests that Egypt's nationalization of the canal threatened global trade, prompting Britain, France, and Israel to intervene militarily. However, the truth behind the Suez Crisis is rooted in a web of political lies and manipulation, with the victors of the narrative hiding their true motives. Britain and France, still holding on to their imperial influence in the Middle East, saw Egypt's President Nasser as a growing threat to their power. The true reason for the invasion wasn't just about protecting trade routes, it was about maintaining their colonial influence in the region. The U.S., initially unaware of the full scope of the invasion, was forced to push for a ceasefire, exposing the rift between the Western powers. The victors of the Suez Crisis, the British and French, rewrote the story, casting themselves as defenders of global stability. But in truth, the invasion was an attempt to preserve their crumbling empires, and the crisis marked the beginning of the end of European colonial dominance in the Middle East. The lies surrounding the Suez Crisis would reveal the fragility of old empires. Chapter 44. The Assassination of John F. Kennedy. The lies behind the official story. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November 1963 remains one of the most significant events in modern history. The story that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone has been challenged by numerous theories suggesting a wider conspiracy. For many, the truth behind Kennedy's assassination was manipulated to protect powerful interests who felt threatened by his policies. Kennedy was a figure who had made enemies both within the U.S. government and abroad. His stance on civil rights, his approach to the Cold War, and his support for a range of progressive reforms had made him unpopular with various powerful factions. The official narrative, pushed by the government and media, insisted that Oswald was solely responsible. But evidence, such as the discrepancies in the ballistics and eyewitness accounts, suggests that more people may have been involved. The narrative of a lone gunman serves to protect those in power, masking the darker truth of a political assassination. The real story behind Kennedy's death is far murkier than the version we've been told. The lies surrounding Kennedy's assassination continue to provoke debate and speculation to this day. Chapter 45: The Rise of Silicon Valley, the Myths of Innovators and Their Lies. Silicon Valley is often hailed as the birthplace of innovation, the hub where the world's most revolutionary technology companies were born. The myth of the self-made entrepreneur, the genius inventor who built their empire from nothing, is a narrative perpetuated by the very companies that benefit from it. But the truth behind the rise of Silicon Valley is one of manipulation, exploitation, and deception. The founders of major tech companies like Apple, Google, and Facebook have been glorified as visionary leaders who changed the world. Yet, the reality is that these companies often manipulated markets, exploited labor, and bend the rules to gain a competitive edge. Many of these so-called innovators relied on a mixture of insider deals, tax loopholes, and shady practices to build their fortunes. The narrative of Silicon Valley as the land of opportunity is not the full story. It's a carefully crafted image designed to maintain the myth of the American dream. The rise of Silicon Valley wasn't just about groundbreaking technology. It was about creating a new elite class with immense wealth and power, while the consequences of their actions were hidden behind the glossy facade of innovation. The lies that built Silicon Valley will continue to influence global economics for years to come. Final payoff. Throughout history, the victors have always controlled the narrative. From the Trojan horse to the rise of Silicon Valley, the lies they told shaped the world we know today. Every empire, every revolution, and every major event was written by those who held power, twisting the truth to maintain control. The stories we've been told of bravery, of heroism, of justice, have often been nothing more than carefully constructed myths, masking the bloodshed, betrayal, and manipulation that made them possible. The reality is far darker. The history we've inherited is a story of deception. The heroes we've worshipped were often the villains, and the victors, far from noble, were the architects of some of the greatest betrayals in human history. Their lies didn't just cover up their darkest actions. They rewrote the very fabric of reality, shaping the world to suit their needs. But the truth is finally surfacing. No longer can these lies go unchallenged. The dark secrets, the manipulations, and the betrayals can no longer be hidden. History's winners may have controlled the past, but they've lost control of the truth. And now, we know it. The final revelation? The real history is far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more revealing than we were ever told.